In this video, we'll take a look at the way the understanding of the relation between grammar, words, and meaning has developed from the mid-1950s to the present day. We'll start with the linguistic revolution of the 1950s, which introduced a scientific rigor to the study of language and a novel conception of the link between thought and grammar. This led to an exciting intellectual debate about the relation between grammar and meaning, known as the Linguistics Wars of the 60s and the 70s, which resulted in quite different approaches to grammar analysis, which are still with us today. We'll finish with a brief look at most recent models like distributed morphology and nanosyntax and see how they have been shaped by the intellectual debate decades ago. The intricacy of the relation between words, grammar, and meaning is perhaps best visible when we look at an English sentence like "we opened a lot of them," and its close equivalent in Polish, "ponaotwieraliśmy je." The Polish sentence represents the same meaning as the English one, but it does so in the form of a complex verb, which has many small subword units, which are called morphemes. These morphemes carry individual meanings, but their placement in the Polish complex verb is quite different than the placement of the corresponding words in the English sentence. For example, the morpheme my, which corresponds to the English sentence initial subject we, is placed at the end of the complex verb in Polish. If we replace the subject in the English sentence with the plural you, it will now correspond to the morpheme cie in the Polish sentence. A different illustration of a non-obvious relation between grammar and meaning is a situation where same-looking grammar structures will have considerably different meanings. For example, the sentences "John is a blonde actor" and "John is a former actor" have exactly the same word orders, which include the adjectives blonde and former directly in front of the noun actor. But while the sentence "John is a blonde actor" means that John is blonde and he is an actor, the sentence "John is a former actor" does not mean that John is an actor at all. That already shows us that the relation between words and grammar and the meaning they carry is not easily predicted. Now, this topic has been at the core of linguistic research since the 1960s, when it took a form of a debate if meaning is a function of grammar or if the grammar is the function of meaning. The answer to this question turned out to be far from obvious. On the one hand, it's clear that in order to construe a meaningful expression, such as the question, "Can you pass me the salt?" it's not enough to simply utter an unorderly set of words like we see in B, like star, salt, the, me, pass, you, can, where the star indicates ill-formedness. This means that we are able to construe a meaningful expression if we follow the rules of grammar. In other words, we begin with grammar. But on the other hand, individual words or even individual subwords carry very specific meaning units. For example, the sentence like "John killed a fly" can be easily decomposed not only into an individual past tense marker id, but also "kill a fly" can be decomposed into "cause a fly to die." Such a decomposition into more basic units of meaning could suggest that we construe words and phrases, that is, larger grammatical expressions, starting with the units of conceptual meaning. Now, the most notable proponent of the idea that linguistic meaning is the function of grammar has been Noam Chomsky, and the debate between these two competing approaches in the 1960s and the 1970s has been often referred to as the Linguistics Wars. The debate eventually led to the development of modern linguistic theories and models like minimalism, syntactic cartography, cognitive linguistics, head-driven phrase structure grammar, distributed morphology, and nanosyntax, just to name a few, and had consequences to our current understanding of the relation between the mental lexicon, grammar, and meaning. Now, in what follows, we will first have a quick look at how the debate began with Chomsky's analysis of English auxiliary system and how it was shaped by further developments in the theory. Then we will see what caused the formulation of the alternative to the grammar-first approach to meaning, which spawned the Linguistics Wars. Then we will have a look at how the debate resolved and how it shaped the few selected present-day analytical paradigms like minimalism, cartography, and nanosyntax. The linguistic revolution, which essentially created the field of modern linguistics, began with Chomsky's solution to a well-known problem in English grammar, namely the situation where the English verb inflection, the present tense third-person singular s, appears in the verb, like in reads, but when the auxiliary verb have is present in the sentence, the s morpheme will no longer appear on read, but on the auxiliary verb, forming has. What is more, as in the C example, the verb can take a different ending, ing, while the auxiliary has still keeps the s ending. And the two verbs can be separated by another auxiliary be, here with the ending n, forming the word been. So, the long-lasting problem in English grammar has always been to find the rule that would allow us to capture these facts and to make the right predictions about what combination of verb, auxiliary, and inflection is going to be well-formed and what combinations are going to be ill-formed. Now, in 1957, Chomsky published a book, Syntactic Structures, which provided an elegant, to say the least, solution to this problem, which rests on the assumption that grammar consists of two types of rules. One is phrase structure rules, or rewrite rules, of the type we see in 8, rewrite x as y. For example, a noun phrase, or NP for short, gets rewritten as a determiner, det, plus noun, n. Det, a determiner, gets rewritten as either a, the, thus, that, or a few other similar words. N, a noun, gets rewritten as either book, cat, dog, or other similar words. A plus gets rewritten as a hash mark, which stands for a word boundary. When we apply these rules to an NP, a noun phrase, we get the following result. By the first rule, we rewrite NP as det plus n. By the rule where we rewrite det as a, and by the rule where we rewrite n as book, we get the plus book. Finally, by the rule where a plus gets rewritten as a hash mark, which stands for a word boundary, we get the book. Along the phrase structure or rewrite rules, Chomsky's other type of rules were transformations, that is, operations that produce new structures from existing ones. An example of a transformation is a conjunction rule in 10, where x before y gets transformed into a string x plus and plus y, where elements x and y can be any constituent, including an NP, which we have just seen. So, according to this transformation, a string such as NP will get rewritten as NP plus and plus NP. Now, when we apply the phrase structure rules we've seen a moment before to the string n plus and plus NP, we will end up with the string the book and the cat, with hash marks interpreted as word boundaries. With such a system of rules, let's return to the problem of the English auxiliary verb system. Chomsky's proposal included the placement of the aux, or auxiliary, element between the subject John and the verb read. The aux is subject to the rule where it gets rewritten as the morpheme s plus an optional pairs of have plus n and be plus ing. If we apply this rule with its both optional ingredients, we get the string John plus s plus have plus n plus be plus ing plus read plus the plus book. Now, the next rule is crucial, but very simple. It says that when we have two elements, x and y, such that x is a member of the set s, n, ing, and y is a member of the set have, be, read, then a string x plus y gets rewritten as y plus x and is followed by the hash mark. The rule has been called affix hopping, as it replaces the order between a morpheme and a preceding verb and adds a word boundary at the end. When we apply this rule to our sentence, we get John plus have plus s hash mark, be plus n hash mark, read plus ing hash mark, the plus book. Now, the last rule replaces a plus by hash mark everywhere except in the context of y plus x, where x is s, n, or ing, and y is have, be, or read. The application of this rule derives the string John hash mark have plus s hash mark be plus n hash mark read plus ing hash mark the hash mark book. Now, bearing in mind that the hash mark is interpreted as a word boundary, we have essentially derived the sentence and effectively solved the long-standing puzzle of English. Now, Chomsky's book contains also other rules, about 30, which are argued to be enough to derive a good portion of English grammar. And this is how transformational grammar was born, whose major tenet was that grammar is a set of finite and learnable rules. That is, learning formal rules means learning a native language. That was a revolutionary result in the mid-1950s, which quickly led to the end of language studies viewed as part of social science, as well as to the end of behaviorism in psychology, but also sparked some interest from the military as it opened up the possibility to automatize translation. But that's a slightly different story. What's interesting to us is that the transformational rules treated words and morphemes alike, and that the meaning was not part of grammar. At least not yet. But that's about to change soon, as the new theory opened up a few possibilities. So, where is meaning in transformational grammar? To understand the way of thinking about the place of meaning in grammar in the early 1960s, let's consider two cases. Case 1 is a situation where same surface grammars, same with respect to word order, have different meanings. For example, the sentences John is easy to please and John is eager to please differ only with respect to the verb choice, but the meanings of both sentences are different in that 14 means that John gets pleased himself and 15 means that John pleases somebody. Now, case 2 is different. We have two different looking sentences, one in the active voice, John kissed Mary, and the other in the passive voice. Mary was kissed by John, but despite this difference in their grammatical structures, both sentences have nearly identical meanings. Both cases can be resolved with transformations. Now, this can be achieved if we represent John is easy to please as involving a base structure, that is a structure before the application of transformations, which involves the constituent please John and a gap in the sentence initial subject position. Now, the surface representation can be achieved with a transformation that moves John from the object position of please to the sentence initial position, filling the subject gap, as indicated with the arrow. Now, in contrast, the base structure of John is eager to please will include a generic some x in the object position of please, where x denotes any possible person, and John in the subject position. Now, the transformation will not involve any movement, as in 18, but a deletion of some x. This will result in the surface structure with the silence after please. With that, we can observe that the meanings of both sentences are captured at their basis, not at the structures after the application of transformations. The same conclusion will apply to our case number 2, where the active and the passive variants of a sentence look differently, but have almost identical meanings. So, if the base structure of an active sentence like John kissed Mary includes a noun phrase 1 plus past tense plus a verb V plus a noun phrase 2, and we apply a passive transformation to such a string, and next we'll apply the familiar affix hopping transformation, and next we'll apply a transformation whereby be plus past tense gets rewritten as the word was. Then we'll end up with Mary was hash mark kiss plus id hash mark by John, the passive structure. We see that, again, the meaning of the derived passive sentence is captured by the shape of its base. This result leads Chomsky in 1965 to update the transformational theory with two levels of grammatical representations, deep structure and surface structure. The deep structure determines the meaning of a grammatical expression, and the surface structure determines the shape of a grammatical expression that gets pronounced. In such a system, transformations will now happen between deep structure and surface structure and will effectively derive surface structures from the underlying deep structure representations. For our sentence in 21, it means that we are able to capture the fact that John is a logical subject in both the active sentence and in the passive, no matter if it appears at the beginning of the sentence in the active and at the end of the sentence in the passive. This soon led to the formulation of what's been known as the cat's postal hypothesis, which submitted that all transformations preserve meaning. That is to say that when two sentences do not differ in meaning, like our example in the active and in the passive, that means that they are identical at deep structure. Conversely, different meanings were supposed to signal the difference at the level of deep structure. If such a hypothesis was true, then perhaps at the level of deep structure, grammar and thought could absorb each other. But the immediate challenge to the idea that all transformations preserve meaning were examples of transformations whose job was to change the meaning, such as the negation insertion transformation, which transforms 22a into 22b. Katz and Polstadl's solution to this problem was to turn these transformations into optional phrase structure or rewrite rules, as for instance in 23. If the negation element not is present in the sentence, then it triggers the transformation, like it does in 24. If it's absent, like in 25, then the transformation doesn't apply. By mid-1960s, the transformational model with deep structure linked meaning and grammar for the first time ever in the history of linguistics, and the long-standing issue of the relation between meaning and form was mediated by an independent module of grammar called syntax, the one that carried transformations. The concept of deep structure was very appealing by itself, as it essentially justified the intuition that grammatical structures have an underlying logical form which can be quite different than what is pronounced in the form of word and morpheme order. The concept of deep structure as an interface with meaning became so appealing that certain authors started to push its boundaries. That was particularly the case with Paul Postle's abstract syntax. The model detailed grammatical representations at deep structure to the point that they became almost indistinguishable from semantic, that is, conceptual, representations. And here is exactly where the problem in the paradise began to surface. Namely, why does a theory of grammar need deep structure if you can just have a semantic representation as an input to grammar? This led to the formulation of the alternative model to Chomsky's transformational grammar, the so-called generative semantics, whose major premise was the claim that semantic representation, that is, structure meaning, is grammar. That differed sharply from Chomsky's model, where grammar rules were independent of meaning. Just like in the Chomsky's model, generative semantics did have transformations and surface structure, but it was derived from a semantic representation, not from deep structure, which was always purely grammatical in Chomsky's model. Now, generative semantics adopted much of the logic of Postle's abstract syntax, and the ensuing academic debates between the two approaches became known as the Linguistics Wars. Generative semantics had an important player in the debate, namely lexical decomposition, that is, a way of representing word meaning as a complex grammatical structure. This was initially practiced by a linguist named George Lakoff in the form of paraphrasing words, especially verbs and verb phrases, into structures with arguably more basic meaning ingredients. For instance, a sentence like "John killed the flies" could be paraphrased into "John caused the flies to die," which could be in turn paraphrased into "John caused the flies to become dead." And the adjective dead itself can be paraphrased as not alive. Lakoff's idea was that all these sentences are derived from the same underlying abstract verbs called deep verbs. In other words, when we also separate the past tense marker id from kill, the sentence "John killed the flies" has an underlying semantic structure that comprises several abstract ingredients. Overall, the analysis of a verb like kill as having a non-atomic representation went precisely against Chomsky's traditional transformational model, where verbs were grammatically atomic and their meaning was interpreted on the basis of conceptual knowledge rather than lexical decomposition. In Chomsky's model, grammatical representations were simpler but required a more powerful interpretive component, while in generative semantics, grammatical representations were much more articulate but included meaningful ingredients. This brings us to the elephant in the room, that is, the way grammatical representations actually look like. So far, we've seen grammatical examples represented in a linear way, the way that directly corresponds to how they are pronounced. But in reality, words and morphemes form constituents, which are called phrases. For example, the article the and the noun glass form a constituent called a noun phrase, or NP for short, because it contains a noun. When we add a verb like break to the noun phrase the glass, we create a verb phrase, because the newly created constituent contains now also the verb. Because Chomsky's traditional transformational model of the 60s assumed non-decomposable grammatical objects like atomic verbs break or kill, its grammatical representations were simple and straightforward. To use a famous example of a sentence, Floyd broke the glass, we see that the hierarchical representation of its constituents is fairly simple. That was not the case with grammatical representations proposed in generative semantics, where due to lexical decomposition, the representations were considerably larger and more detailed. We can see that in the diagram taken from Hodge Ross and George Lakoff's work, which contains abstract verbs like happen, say, assume, come about, or be. What's interesting is that the debate between the two approaches caught some attention from the mainstream media at that time and was even covered by New York Times. Here's the photo featuring the competing representations of the sentence Floyd broke the glass from the article in 1972. The debate at the time concentrated on how much lexical information is used in grammar. That is, if grammar uses already preformed words that are created from individual morphemes in a separate module, a submodule of grammar devoted only to word formation, or, as generative semantics submitted, if grammar forms both words, phrases, and sentences in one module. This overabundance of abstractions and grammatical structures proposed by generative semantics eventually led to the end of the Linguistics Wars in 1975, with a number of scholars adopting Chomsky's far less abstract interpretive model. While the model of grammar with deep structure persisted throughout the 1980s, it got replaced with a conceptual different framework known as minimalism, introduced by Chomsky in the first half of the 1990s. Putting all other conceptual changes aside, the new framework dispensed with deep structure and with surface structure. However, these two, so to say, old representational levels were eliminated for reasons different than what was argued by generative semantics during the Linguistics Wars. Namely, minimalists simplified the model by equipping grammatical derivations with two interpretive interfaces, the phonological form, or PF, and the logical form, or LF for short. A PF is a sound representation of a grammatical expression which can be pronounced by the speaker. The LF is a variant of a syntactic structure which undergoes semantic interpretation. There is no place for deep structure and logical form within one model. As far as the grammatical representations are concerned, minimalism postulates conservative, predominantly word-based representations. For instance, the familiar sentence, Floyd broke the glass, will include only a few extra conceptual ingredients with respect to what we have seen in its representation according to the traditional transformational model in the 1970s. For instance, tense is a separate grammatical category from a verb, hence both categories, tense and the verb, are represented separately in minimalism. Much more refined grammatical representations are advanced in the so-called cartographic approach, which has been developed since the mid-1990s, most notably by Italian linguists Luigi Rizzi and Guglielmo Cinque. Its goal is to identify a detailed hierarchy of grammatical features. This also applies to those grammatical features that are involved in specific interpretations of individual constituents. For example, there is a variant of a sentence, I will read this book tomorrow, where we can put a particular type of emphasis on this book, as in, this book I will read tomorrow. This is what we call topicalization, and as we can see, in this process we are fronting the book to the beginning of the sentence. According to cartography, this is so because the position to which we move the book here is linked to a specific grammatical position where the topic interpretation takes place. This means that the topic itself is a grammatical feature and, as such, is part of grammatical representation, just like a verb or a noun. Now, this line of research led to exciting cross-linguistic findings about the universality of the ordering of a range of different grammatical features. What is more, these features are not abstract, as in generative semantics, but are often overt. This is the case, for instance, with the Polish particle to in a sentence like in 30, Marię to okradli jej własni sąsiedzi. The sentence means that Mary got robbed by her own neighbors, and the particle to marks the topic interpretation of Mary. The lexical manifestation of specific semantic ingredients in grammar is an interesting result, which has had consequences for theories that investigate words and morphemes and their relation to phrasal grammar. The two major approaches to words and grammar that have emerged in the last 30 years are distributed morphology and nanosyntax. Distributed morphology, introduced in the early 1990s by Alec Marantz and Maurice Halley, is a theoretical model whose main claim is that both words and sentences are construed alike. That is to say, there is only a single generative agent that derives word and sentence structures. The theory relies on a number of auxiliary mechanisms that regulate the pairings between grammatically represented features and sound. These include also contextual sensitivity in the way certain grammatical structures are realized with special or irregular word forms. For instance, if we consider past forms of an irregular verb went and a regular verb smoked, we'll immediately observe that the second is more complex in that it has the extra id morpheme at the end. In distributed morphology, this result is achieved by inserting morphemes into individual nodes of a grammatical representation according to memorized rules, which are sometimes contextual. So, any verb, go, smoke, or any other, can be inserted into a V position in a grammatical structure, and by default, the past tense in grammar will be realized with the id morpheme. This correctly derives the complex form smoked in 32, but gives the wrong result for 31, as there is no such form as goed, hence the asterisk next to it. This is so because, according to distributed morphology, there are also context-sensitive rules in English whereby go is replaced with went before the past tense node in grammar. But the result in 31 is still ill-formed because it produces an unattested sequence went id. Well, this is because we need to apply another context-sensitive rule, the one where past tense becomes realized as a phonetic zero. This rule will only apply after a defined set of verb forms, which includes went. With such a rule, we can finally obtain the attested form went. As we see, distributed morphology, despite the fact that it was introduced in the early 90s, takes after the traditional transformational model, which relied on context-sensitive rules. Also, the grammatical representations that have been assumed in distributed morphology are usually much more conservative than the ones postulated by generative semantics in the 70s or more currently in cartography. This is quite different than what we see in nanosyntax, despite the fact that it shares with distributed morphology the idea that words and sentences are derived with the single generative agent. Nanosyntax was first introduced in the mid-2000s by Michal Starke. Its major tenet is that grammar doesn't work on words and morphemes. Instead, it produces words and morphemes from individual grammatical features. As a consequence, grammatical representations can be submorphemic. This can be illustrated with the difference between the verbs go and went. The form go realizes a bare verb phrase, just like other verbs can do. So the realization of the verb phrase in grammar as go, run, or smoke is a matter of a speaker's free choice. But once we add the past tense feature in grammar, our choice for pronouncing the resulting structure becomes limited to one, namely to went, since only went realizes past tense and go together. In this way, we also elegantly capture the fact that the past form went structurally includes a more basic, non-tensed verb form go. Such a system is more similar to what was argued by generative semantics, in the sense that the presence of one verb form, like went, depends on the grammatical representation of a different, more basic verb form, like go, in the same syntactic representation. So let's wrap up this little overview. I think we can safely conclude that while current models like minimalism, cartography, distributed morphology, and nanosyntax have all introduced novel conceptions of the relation between words, grammar, and meaning, they all have been influenced by the earlier approaches like Chomsky's transformational grammar or generative semantics. In this sense, it seems that the development in this arguably most basic area of linguistic theory is not different than what we see in other areas of science, where newer theories replace the old ones but often preserve some of the old rationale. Parts of this talk about Chomsky's transformational grammar have been based on Noam Chomsky's 2002 re-edition of his 1957 book Syntactic Structures, published by Mouton de Gruyter. The parts about the Linguistics Wars have been based on the second edition of Randy Harris's 2021 book The Linguistics Wars in America, published by Oxford University Press, and the references cited there, which also includes the reference to Paul Postel's 1969 illustration of the generative semantics model, which was used in this presentation.